The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
One second. Record. Good evening. On behalf of the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, I would like to welcome you to our special webinar to support educators in this unprecedented time of emergency closure due to COVID-19. This evening's webinar is entitled Building a Community Response to Crisis. This webinar has been generously sponsored by Wayside Publishing. Please visit waysidepublishing.com for more information about how Wayside can assist with your remote teaching and learning needs. My name is John Carlino, NECTFL Executive Director, and I'll be hosting this evening's webinar along with NECTFL 2020 Chair Nathan Lutz and NECTFL Board Member Chahwan as moderators. We are grateful to our presenters, George Chahwan and Ian Wollman, for offering us their time and expertise. This webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording will be posted to our website tomorrow. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour with 45 to 50 minutes devoted to the presentation. The remaining time will serve as Q&A with the presenters to answer your questions. Attendees are encouraged to submit their questions during the webinar using the question feature of the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. Our moderators will organize these questions and share them with the presenters as relevant and/or at the end. In the event of technical difficulties, please remain connected as you are able. If the difficulties are on your end, please contact GoToMeeting customer support for assistance. If you're having difficulty with sound, please click on phone call under audio in the control panel and call in with the number provided. And now please let me take this opportunity to introduce you to our presenters, George and Ian. George is chair of the language department at Choate Rosemary Hall and consults with language departments around the world. He earned his DESS from the Lebanese University and an MA from the University of Geneva. He has presented at various local and international conferences and currently serves as the chair of the ACTFL Arabic Special Interest Group and on the NECTFL board on the QFI Arabic Honor Society Advisory Council. Ian Wollman is a teacher of Chinese at Choate Rosemary Hall. He earned a BA in East Asian Studies from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and is currently working towards an MA in teaching Chinese as a second language at Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont. Before teaching, Ian studied at Suzhou University in Suzhou, China, and worked at a record label in Beijing. George and Ian, thank you for sharing your time with us. Welcome to the webinar.
Good evening and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are tuning in. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar to discuss building a community response to crisis. Before we get started, on behalf of Ian and myself, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you to John Carlino for this wonderful introduction, for Nathan Lutz and Chahwan for moderating this webinar, and to NECTFL and its board for giving us the time and space to share this project with you all. We would also like to thank Wayside Publishing for sponsoring this webinar. We can talk about community response amidst all the pain that has hit the core of this nation once again, especially this past week, without acknowledging the horrific act towards George Floyd. In this slide, Syrian artists Aziz Asmar and Anis Hamdoun are depicted next to their mural of George Floyd in Idlib, a war-ravaged province in northwest Syria. Fellow colleagues, let us take a minute of silence to honor him and remember all those who have been victims to continue the cruel acts of violence, racism, and hate in our community and beyond. The webinar objectives. So tonight, together, we will understand how to teach about response to a crisis, how to design synchronous and asynchronous activities to help students understand and process a crisis. Together also, we will identify some of the setbacks that students and teachers may encounter to select technological tools that enhance and or facilitate this project, and also how to scale this project up or down to meet the students' needs. This initiative started when Ian approached me in the Chinese section via email on the morning of Thursday, March 26, about his term-long project involving designing solutions to community concerns during the pandemic. As we were preparing to shift to remote teaching and learning within a week, this project spoke to a great area of need. As educators, we always talk about the importance of rethinking our curriculum to reflect our students' representations and voice. We work on equipping them with linguistic and cultural tools, but we fail sometimes to provide them with a space, not only to discuss and reflect on ideas, but to act on them using their critical thinking skills. That's where this project comes in very handy. Ian?
Ian, I think you're on mute.
Ian?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, I'm going to begin by talking about why it's important to address the COVID-19 pandemic in our classes. I think it's obviously created a good deal of stress and harm for our students. Some students are constantly thinking about it, whether they're directly affected or not. And on the other hand, some students have mostly just experienced boredom, distraction, inconvenience. So why potentially add to the stress of the situation by assigning a project about the source of that stress? So one of the goals for the project that my intermediate Chinese class worked on this spring was to create a place for students to share how their communities have been affected by COVID-19 through reflection, through conversation, and to their comfort level. Another goal that I was hoping to accomplish was to allow students to translate their feelings of frustration, their feelings of sadness into action. I hoped that by designing small-scale solutions for problems faced by local communities, the students were able to focus on the positive ways that people can respond to crisis. And I was also hoping that students were able to take a seemingly insurmountable problems such as a global pandemic and recognize what things they can do to help. I think this idea of taking a large issue and identifying issues that can be tackled can really be applied to other sort of larger scale problems that students see in the world, including challenging systemic racism and the police murders of Black Americans. Finally, I think it's also a good opportunity for collaboration, between members of the same department, between departments at a school, and to maintain a sense of community within faculty and students as a whole. And so George is going to talk to us about ways in which this can create some collaboration opportunities.
So after discussing this project with Ian and the Chinese section over email, I felt as if I was missing something very important. I felt that this was an opportunity for a more meaningful project and a greater collaboration, as Ian mentioned. This is when I thought that this could be an opportunity for our 7 languages to work as one instead of working in our own cultural silos. So I asked Ian to share his idea and his project with the group during a departmental meeting. And our colleagues were very supportive, and some even more excited than Ian and I were to embark on this journey. At the meeting, we shared different ideas and questions, and colleagues were invited to adjust and modify this project to respond to their students' needs and choices, and to best fit their curriculum. And we started this project the final week of March. So we will share with you now the different forms this project can take. So savor the idea, and we hope it will prove fruitful to you as well.
So obviously there are plenty of ways to define problems and create solutions for those problems. But I went with something for this terms project that came from a project designed by my previous mentor, Lilia Tai Harto at Phillips Academy. It's a fairly straightforward process in which students begin by identifying a community that they would like to serve, whether that's a community that they currently live in or are a part of, or a community that is outside of their vicinity. Some examples of those communities are students at the school that we live at and work at, the elderly population in the students' hometowns, local small business owners, etc. And so after choosing a community, the students embark on the first step of that process that you see here, which is understanding the ideas and the experiences, the stories of people who live in those communities, and to understand how they're affected by the larger problem of the COVID-19 pandemic. They did this through interviews, through research, and collecting quotes from media resources. After collecting those opinions and experiences, they moved on to defining what that problem, or defining a specific problem faced by their community of choice, and defining it in clear terms. After that, they brainstormed potential solutions, created a detailed plan, and executed that plan. So they took some time to discuss as individual groups, and then filled out plans with information about resources needed, and time scale, venues needed, etc., before finally creating a final product that they could send out into their community. I do want to mention that in this process, I left out a crucial step, which is collecting feedback from the community that the students were serving throughout the process. I think oftentimes when creating a solution for a problem, it's possible to do more harm than good. And in order to avoid that, it's important to consult with the people you're serving every step of the way. So now I'm going to go into specific examples about how my class approached each step, with some example activities as well as examples of student work. So let's move on to the first step, which is understand or empathize. So the goal of this step of the project was to understand how people in the students' chosen communities were or are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And to do that, students wrote, they first wrote an opening reflection about their perception of the issue. This was done in the target language, but could also be done in English, sort of to get ideas moving. After writing a personal reflection, they collected quotes from news sources. If they had the opportunity to and the means to, they interviewed community members. And then finally, the final step of this process was choosing a representative quote from the interviews and quotes that they found online, and summarizing it in the target language. And then finally writing a reflection in the target language about what they've learned since the initial reflection. Feedback from the step was mostly positive. In fact, most of the feedback I received about this project was about this first step. Many students mentioned that it helped relate the global or national situation with COVID-19 with what people near them were experiencing. So the next step of this project is define. So on the left here, you can see some examples of just my instructions that I had in a Google Doc for all of the students, as well as workspace within the same doc for each group, and then examples on the right. The define step, the goal of the define step was to explain, to have students explain to others in clear terms how a specific group of people has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to propose a potential solution. And to do so, students, they pretend to be a group of journalists from a Chinese language publication. They wrote a news report in the target language about the effects of the pandemic on the countries where they were currently residing as a whole, and then on their specific communities that they were researching and hoping to serve. And then they also had, there was also a section of that activity where they reported on how a group of high school students was addressing those issues. So they sort of wrote about their own potential solution as if they were a group of journalists from a Chinese language publication presenting on it. So some examples of what students have created, you can see one on the right there. This group was hoping to serve stressed out young remote learners, so high school students, middle school students, by providing them with an activity book with pages that you could color in, prompts that you could respond to, so journaling prompts. Some other examples includes a plan to provide community members with longer lasting foods such as grains and legumes and canned food. Another group, a third group, created a platform on social media for small business owners to promote their businesses. So what you see on the right there is an example of the first part, the introduction to their report in Chinese with an English translation below it. So moving on from the define stage, the students worked to create a solution, which they started to do in the define stage, but moving on towards creating a plan. So again, this is just an example of the same Google document with a table that I had students fill out. In order to, or the goal for this specific part of the project was to plan out in detail how their group would act, how they would create their change in their communities. And to do so, they employed a little bit of backwards design. They answered a few questions, did a bit of reflection in the beginning of this stage of the project. It's specifically the question that you can see on the screen here, which is how will you know if it's successful, or how will you know if your plan is successful? Students had conversations about that specific question and then worked from there to come up with a plan, a comprehensive plan for what resources they would need, what venues they might require to rent or use, and the sort of time frame of each step. After this part of after creating their plan, each group then looked at another group's plan and highlighted any unrealistic or ambiguous areas of their plan, trying to see whether or not they could execute it without help from the people who wrote it. So Group A took a look at Group B's plan and sort of tried to see if they could execute Group B's plan without any guidance from Group B. So after creating their plan, they moved on to the fourth and final stage of this project, which is to create. The goal of this was to create a final product, just to create either something that's a mock-up of the product that they might put out into the world, or something, or a real product that they would want to put on the internet or pass around in their communities or post somewhere. Some examples of this could include social media posts, which you see right here. We have a couple of mock Instagram posts. The one on the left is from the group who created a activity book for high school and middle school students. This is an example of the page that they created for people to color in, sort of posing as if this is a user submission or a submission from somebody who had used the activity book and colored it in. The one on the right is from the group of students looking to distribute food in communities that do not have access to it. Yeah, and so those are some of the examples. Looking forward, I'd like to move on to George's piece. George took this project and ran with it. He created many, many more interesting activities than I did, and I'd like to give him some space to tell you all about it.
Thank you, Ian. So I did adapt Ian's project the same way he drafted it, and as I mentioned earlier, I felt it was a great opportunity, in fact, to discuss this. But as any project we start with our students, we always think about how we want to introduce that topic to them. And here, what I'm going to share with you are some of my Google slides that, so we were teaching via Zoom the whole time. And I wanted to have kind of something that the students will be able to focus on while we are in Zoom. And to kind of engage them in some way. So I thought about creating this activity where I wanted to introduce the topic, and I wanted to give them a picture and see what they would say about it. So using the interpretive mode is ask the students to kind of try with the limited vocab that you have in Arabic to be able to describe what you are seeing and what does that represent to you. So it was a warm-up activity. But before we delved really into creating that word bank that they need, in fact, to express themselves and to speak about COVID-19 in Arabic, or the pandemic, of course, I had laid out for them the objectives of that lesson. So each lesson had 3 or 4 objectives that we needed to go to, and one of them, so it was a Monday after the weekend. So I said, okay, one way to recycle old vocab and a vocab that in fact they will need to talk about COVID-19, and they know some of it. So I had these couple of questions. I used the breakout rooms for the students, and I gave them these questions as an aid. If they didn't have any questions, they can talk about these questions to kind of keep the conversation going, and using here the interpersonal mode with our students. Some of the questions: هل قرأت كتاب جديد في عطلة الأسبوع؟ هل ساعدت أهلك في تنظيف البيت؟ هل كان عندك الكثير من الواجبات وفي أي صفوف؟ هل تكلمت مع أصدقائك بواسطة الإنترنت أو أي مسلسل أو برنامج تشاهد الآن؟ وإلى ماذا تفتقد? So a couple of these questions are like, what new book have you read this weekend? Did you help your parents in cleaning the house or the apartment? Did you have lots of homework? Did you speak with your friends through the internet? What new series have you watched on TV, on Netflix? And what do you miss? And if you realize the type of questions I had for them, in some way is to create this interpersonal activity, but on the other hand, it's also to check in on them and to give them opportunity to check in on each other and kind of create a way for them to engage in these conversations in the classroom, before we delve into talking about that topic. And from there, we went to the second activity, which was here we wanted to start, in fact, building our word bank so that they can have the tools that they need to express themselves about COVID-19. And I didn't want to come and give them like a list of vocab, oh, this is the vocab that you needed to do. So I created a Padlet, and that I will be sharing with you later on in the PowerPoint, where you will find all the resources. And I put for them some infographics in Arabic. They had also a video from the WHO about like how to clean your hands, and everything was in Arabic. And so I gave them, as you can see, 20 minutes to work in pairs or in small groups to go through the infographics and to create a Google Doc and start putting the words in Arabic and guess the meaning in English. And then I told the students, you will do that, and then at the end we will come together as a group, and then we will look at the words and see if you were able, in fact, to guess the meanings and to start creating. And in fact, this is how to empower our students and to show them way if that in the future they are to talk about a topic that we haven't discussed in class. What is the way to look at creating vocab instead of going right away to translation. One of the best ways, in fact, is to show them how to do some research, go and find authentic resources, double check these resources and with the English, and so that they make sure that, in fact, what the words that they are using are the right words. That's how the media is talking about it. This is the jargon that it is used, let's say, in the medical field or in the journalistic field or whatever. So this is how they started working on building their own vocab. And the third one, it is always important when we have a project, and this is something that I learned a couple of years ago after a visit to High Tech High in California. Before, when I used to do project-based learning, I used to have the project, give it to the students, give them, okay, you have a week to realize it. They will bring it back to me, and then they will submit the final project, and then I will go through it. So no feedback was given along the way. The students sometimes had maybe questions about the project, but they had to wait till after class or some other time to come and ask me. And I have found it more interesting and, in fact, more helpful and more informative to me and to them to create time and space in the classroom to discuss the project together. And although the project was laid out in English, so we discussed the course in English, the project in English, they understood what they had to do. And from there, we went back to the target language so that they can start working on continuing to produce their word bank and go with the different steps that Ian laid out in that project. Here is another example for also another picture or another class that I had with them. Again, it's interpretive mode. As we can see, we were talking at some point in the middle of the program. I said, it's time maybe to check on how they are feeling. So I used some of the vocab that they already knew, you know, how to say I'm happy, or I'm afraid, or I'm angry, which is also some vocab that's going to be helpful for them to express what they are feeling. So they had to kind of come up with sentences and then just like interpret what they are seeing and talk about it. And then again, we have the objectives for the class that it is always given to them. It's very important, and I know, I'm sure many of you do that, if not all of you, is to explain to our students why we are doing what we are doing and how is that tie, in fact, to what we have done in the class before and what's going to come next. The more the students understand what they are doing, the more buy-in they have in the project, and the more they are, in fact, willing to invest of their time and energy to be able to produce something that they are proud of. So one of the first activities here, it was, I gave them, again, 3 questions, but this time, in fact, they had to do a self-reflection. So these questions were for them, not to discuss in breakout rooms, not to talk about them at first in the interpersonal mode, but in fact to take some time and in the interpretive mode to reflect about their state, how they are feeling now in the quarantine. Are they worried about their future? What are the things that they are worried about? These are the types of questions that I had for them. And yes, they are a little bit of a heavy question, but here again, I know my students, I have built a good relationship with them. This is our 3rd term together, and I have high school students, and in fact, we were at a place where we can discuss these things and be comfortable with each other. And this is always very important, in fact, to check in and see what type of questions are we discussing with our students, how much do we know our students, how much our students are comfortable to talk about these questions with us. And one of the things when we moved to the remote teaching and learning, it felt that we are mostly focusing in class on the speaking and reading and listening, and we are not doing a lot of writing or presentational writing with our students. So this activity was to use the Padlet, where I can see what they are writing at the same time, and everyone took the time to, they had 15 minutes, they had to think about these questions and write about them in Arabic. So they were typing on Padlet at the same time, again, to do some of the presentational writing, making sure that we are navigating all the modes of communication, not just focusing on one mode. And you will see some examples of their work later on in the Padlet. And then the third one, it was like one of the step 2. So here they had to identify, as we said, the problem, and then they had to bring articles that ties to that problem. And my students decided to work, as Ian said, decided to focus on the communities in which they were living. Currently, some of them, they were international students, but they have settled in some cities here in the United States so that they continue to learn remotely and not go back home. This was a family decision. So they also focused on the community in which they were living. So they had to come up with, to come to class and bring some articles in English from the local newspapers that addresses a need in that community. And so they uploaded it to Padlet, and then they had to write a blurb about it in Arabic to explain what's the problem that they are identifying. And then we had to discuss it all together. So here we did some presentational speaking, because they were presenting their topics to each other, so everyone is aware of what topic they are presenting. And here I collected some activities that we did so that you are also aware of what other activities. It doesn't mean if we are focusing on COVID-19 that this is the only thing we are going to talk about. So during this whole term, we had, for example, many celebrations. We had Ramadan, we had Easter, we had Shabbat, and so also we had to kind of to talk about all these celebrations. And for example, they had this picture about Ramadan, and they had to all these questions, you know, why there are 2 years depicted in that pictures, why do we have stars and why do we have the crescent, what representations do they mean for the Muslim community? You know, do you celebrate Ramadan, or do you celebrate Fasah, or do you celebrate Easter? And also questions that they are inspired from COVID-19, what those communities are missing. So again, you are focusing on the community, on the needs of the community, but in a different context, slightly different context. As well, because if you look a little bit to the left to the screen, you will see a picture of Queen Elizabeth when she delivered her address or speech to the English people about COVID-19. So we listened to a part of that in Arabic, and we also discussed it, and they read the article in Arabic using the vocab that they have been. So this was a way to reinforce the vocab using authentic material, empowering them so that they feel that they can do this. And again, we had also Earth Day. And so we were talking about Earth Day in the light of COVID-19 and the pandemic that has hit the world. So these are just examples of some of the activities in the different modes that we have done in class.
Great. So I want to quickly address some of the setbacks or challenges that teachers might anticipate when employing this kind of project in their classes, or at least talk about the setbacks that I experienced in my intermediate Chinese class. Because of things that I mentioned before, where you have a global pandemic affecting a lot of people in a lot of different ways, the engagement in each class and the quality of language production was somewhat inconsistent. Obviously, that's to be expected. I didn't even notice this when I was putting together the slide, but you'll see on the right there's a student on his phone. That happens every so often in a remote learning environment. I think my main issue as a teacher was gauging students' emotional load and workload. Without the sort of incidental, casual conversations that you have before and after class, or between classes, between classrooms, and without some of that face-to-face time, it's hard to understand how students are feeling at the moment, and it's also hard to understand in a remote teaching environment exactly how much work you're giving your students. At least for me, I didn't have any experience with remote teaching before this spring. And so I had to constantly sort of ask, engage students how much time each activity took them and adjust accordingly. I addressed this, like I said, through some just asking students, trying to create some places or time in class when they could have those incidental interactions that happen usually when they're filing in or leaving. That was occasionally in English, occasionally in Chinese, whatever felt like was appropriate at the moment. Breakout rooms in Zoom was especially useful for that, doing activities such as Four Corners or just simple sort of group check-ins was really helpful. I also, students in this class did weekly journals, reflective journals. We began the term with setting a couple of goals for ourselves and for the people who we're sharing our living space with. So what am I going to do for myself when I'm in lockdown, or when I'm sort of confined to my house most of the time? What am I going to do for maybe my family or my guardians or the people who I'm living with? And so students talked about what they might do every day, what they might do every week, every month, and that was a thing that they could talk about in their weekly journals. But the journals were just open for whatever they wanted to discuss. Some of those journals were shared with the entire class and were commented on by the classmates. Other journals were just seen by me, and then other journal entries were just private journal entries for students to reflect privately. Access to resources was also an issue, as it is with any situation where you're doing remote learning. So not everybody had access to quiet places to do work or to attend remote classes in. There were some issues with high-speed internet access, as well as access to Google. This I addressed a bit by doing a lot of this project's work asynchronously. Students did it on their own time, and I gave them sort of a longish time frame to complete most of the activities that I thought would have been hard to do if they were having issues with high-speed internet or access to, say, Google Docs. Yeah, we can move on to the next slide.
So in the next slide, we are going to talk about what technological tools have we used, in fact, to carry out this project. And I would say that the beauty of this project, and in fact, in any project, if it wasn't tied to a specific technological tools, but give the students the choice to choose whatever tool, in fact, works for them, and help them express their idea and serve them better. So as I said, to meet and synchronous meetings, as a school, we were using Zoom. So we used Zoom, we used the breakout rooms, we used the chat, in fact, to do our synchronous meetings and to discuss. As you can see here to the left, it's a picture of me with some of my students who participated in this project. Then, as I mentioned earlier, I used Padlet, in fact, to, oops, sorry, I used Padlet. Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, George.
Okay, sorry. So I used Padlet, where all the products, or so this is the project. For example, here you can see the infographics that I posted for my students. You can see also the videos that they have created. You could see the articles that they have published with the blurb on them as well. You can see the activity that I spoke about it earlier, when they had to reflect in writing about how they are feeling. And also all the other projects. And Padlet is great because, in fact, it was one place where we were able to have everything, all of our Google Docs, all of our videos and pictures, and everything we needed, in fact, to carry out this project. Another tool that, in fact, the students used, and I'm going to show it to you so that you can see some of the projects that they have realized at the end. So one group decided to use Canva. So they identified the problems that they identified in the community. In the beginning, all the restaurants were closed, or people couldn't really go to restaurants, or some restaurants didn't do a curbside pickup or delivery. So some people found themselves that they have to cook, and not many people were. So they used to rely on restaurants or dining halls, for example, like in our school, to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So they wanted to come up with a cookbook in Arabic, where they can share some recipes that they are easy to make, like a 2-step or 3-step maximum recipe. And what the beauty of what they did, I'm going to show you. So they used Canva to create that book. And so this is the book that they have created. So they started with who are the authors. So they gave a blurb. So we have Chris Gore Crimes, we have Sam Curtis, and we have Jago. And they shared different recipes that comes from their own culture, in fact, and some recipes that comes from the Arab world, like the hummus or the falafel. They also shared the shepherd pie or the banana bread. So they also wanted to include a piece of them in that book. So they mixed the Arabic culture with the American culture or Spanish culture or Italian, Irish culture that they have. Another group, in fact, they went a little bit deeper in their thinking, and this is a great way to see how students react to the same project in different ways. And the other group decided to use, in fact, Google, and they built this Google slide. And they spoke about how coronavirus, in fact, impacted small businesses in their own communities. And this project was carried out by Gideon Reiter and Rumi. And as you would see here, so this is the problem. They talk about like how the small business are losing customers. They can't, they are going to close if this situation continue. They showed statistics as well about all these numbers and collected data. And then the first solution, for example, they said that they could, some of these businesses, they could create the delivery service so that they can continue in business. And then the other solution that they suggested also is that the government will give like a salary or a posted salary for everyone so that they can keep in the business. So they decided to do, in fact, the plan was one of the steps is to write a letter to Congress, is to create a survey for the local community to make sure that they know exactly what they want and how they could help them. And you will see here, for example, this is a link to the survey that they created in Google Forms. So they have the questions in English and in Arabic that you can see that they shared with the local businesses to collect the data, asking if they had to lay out employees due to coronavirus, how many employees, if yes, how much revenue did you make last year, how was your business been affected by coronavirus. So you can see also from the type of questions that they are asking, how they are trying to understand this community and in fact its need. And then they wrote also a letter to the Congress on behalf of the class to lay out the problem and ask for that salary that should be given or wage to employees in small businesses to support them. So this is also another way of, in fact, using the technological tools. And also they used Quizlet, for example, after they had created all their banquet on Google Docs, and after we have discussed the words and made sure that we have the right translation in English and in Arabic, and we agreed all on the words, they moved them to Quizlet and they created themselves a Quizlet that they shared with each other. And in fact, this was also, of course, we used Quizlet Live and all the other activities that comes with it. So this is about the technological piece.
And so a couple of times throughout this process, throughout this project, this term, I ran into the problem of misestimating how long certain parts of the project would take. And I think especially if it's a teacher's first time doing remote learning, remote teaching, that can definitely be an issue. And so scaling down this project, whether it's to address that specific problem or because you don't want to dedicate an entire term to a project like this, scaling it down is definitely possible. One suggestion that I received was that students can focus on one or a couple of parts of the process. So maybe start with, maybe focus on just part one, where the students are doing a bit of reflective work about their perception of how communities are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then collecting a bit of, collecting some testimony of people's experiences, how their community has been affected, and then finishing that up with a bit of reflection. Students could also focus on, say, one of the last steps, which is drawing up a plan, and put in, say, a day or two of work creating a comprehensive plan. You know, whatever is appropriate for where you are at the moment in terms of language proficiency skills or content vocabulary. This project can definitely be scaled down to match. What's important, though, is encouraging students to continue doing the work on their project. If the term comes to an end and they haven't produced a final product, if they didn't do the step of collecting feedback from the communities that they're trying to serve, it's important as a teacher to encourage students to do that. In the specific project that I did, students were not required to actually do their plan. They weren't required to post anything on social media if they were trying to create a social media campaign, or they weren't required to actually create a GoFundMe page to raise money. But I definitely encourage students to do that if they wanted to. And so where do we go from here?
So great question, Ian. Where do we go from here? We hope that this kind of sample of project was inspiring and helped you think about the different ways that you could engage your own students in some of these conversations. Yes, some of them are difficult conversations. Like, for example, if you talk about social justice, if you want to engage them in conversation about what is happening right now in this country, in their community, and give them space to feel heard and to feel valued and to share, in fact, their grief, or even to hear the different perspectives that we have in class. How do we create opportunities for them in the class, as I mentioned in the beginning, not just to have the words to talk about it, but in fact to act on it. So take it that we always say in language classroom, we are probing our students to the next level. And I think in our project, we need to start probing our students to the step of acting on these issues on the community, trying to be an actor of change and make change happen in many ways. But I also understand that maybe it depends, all of these issues and conversations and projects are age related, we need to look into consideration what age group are we teaching, how comfortable are the students with this topic, how do we in fact bridge that so that they and give them the tools to feel comfortable to talk about it. Also taking into consideration the group that we have in the class and how is that might affect them. And so are they ready to have these questions or not? And this kind of relies on you, on your common sense. You know your students best. So when you see that they are ready to engage in such work, I think we need to give them that push and support them and be there to help them do that. So as I mentioned, all these resources and the Padlet are going to be available to you. We hope this has proven informative and helpful. And if you have any questions, we will have at the end my email and Ian's email if you would like to reach out to us with about any part of this presentation. And now we will take some questions.
Thank you, George and Ian, for these great presentations. We do have quite a few questions. The first question actually from quite a few people like Nora, Mimi, and Nadia. The question is like, how do you monitor the project's progress? Do you use rubrics? If you do use rubrics, do you create a common rubric to assess the students or individual rubrics per language?
In the Arabic class, in my experience with this group of students and this project in particular, in fact, the students created their own rubric. They created their own rubric. What are the things that you would need to, in fact, after we have discussed the project, as I showed in the first slide, and we talked about what are the different steps of the project, the students came together to create a rubric and to talk about what are the different steps that they need, what are the different tools that they need, in fact, to be able to do. And I used their rubric to evaluate their progress along with the 4 steps that Ian has laid out in the initial project that he shared with us.
In my Chinese class, we also wrote some rubrics based off of the question, how will we know if our group's project will be successful? I provided them some categories of feedback that I would be giving them throughout the process in terms of their writing in Chinese and the content of their work. In terms of how to monitor it, we did most of our work in Padlet and Google Docs, which made it fairly easy for me to write comments as they were working. During synchronous classes, I could monitor everybody's page or every group's page and go into a breakout room if I needed to, or just write a quick comment if I needed to. And then after they had completed each step of the process, I could give them feedback through that comment and allow other students, other groups to give feedback through Google Docs.
And students also had access to us during conference periods or collaboration period that were available to them, where they could come and ask specific questions if they needed, or if they didn't have time during the synchronous session, or they needed more help. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Another question. This is in regard to the Chinese portion of the project. How did the community receive the project? Was there any anti-Chinese sentiment that was stoked? Was there any controversy around that? And then a second person's question, but it runs alongside this, is was there any pushback from the parents regarding these topics?
I won't speak for George, but I didn't receive any feedback either way from parents in terms of how communities were responding, because we didn't actually, because most of the information that students collected during the Understand and Empathize, like the first section of the project, was from internet resources or community members or members of their own community, such as the high school students at Choke Rosemary Hall. There was no pushback at all from community members. And like I said, there was only, I think, one group that actually created an Instagram page to send out into the world and be accessible to the community at large, and they haven't received any feedback from people or any messages from people.
Same from my group of students and parents.
Thank you. The next question, I think George also mentioned about using Padlet and also Google Docs. So the question is, would you address pros and cons of Padlet versus Google Doc? Can you talk where students posted their weekly reflection, Padlet or Google Docs?
We used Padlet to post everything. So on Padlet, the students, I uploaded for students authentic resources, in fact, to start building their word bank. And then they started uploading the articles that addressed the need or the problem that they identified in the society. And then they uploaded their videos where they had to create, for example, one of the activities was to create a video to give advice to a friend on how to stay safe during Corona, during this time. The reflection piece that I spoke about, it was also in Padlet. The students, they just double-clicked on the wall, created a box, and they were typing in Arabic right there. They also linked some of the Google Docs. The Google Docs, it was more, for example, when they started working on, like they used the Google form to create the survey and they linked it to Padlet. They used the Google Docs to create their slides where they are identifying the different steps of a plan. And they chose so. I didn't choose for them, or I didn't encourage one or the others. The only choice that I made for them is that I said to them, we are going to use Padlet because we are going to have all of our resources accessible in one space, that we can see everything at the same time. We don't need to go into folders. And I think I love Google Classrooms and I love Google Slides, and I use it as well, and my students use it too. I think the beauty of Padlet is that you can see everything in one place. You don't need to go into folders. You just scroll down and everything will be available to you and there to view.
I did organize everything into folders in Google Drive. It was fairly straightforward. Each group had their own folder in Google Drive where they posted individual member work. So there was one document for that, and then there was another document for group work. And like I said, it was easy to pay attention to what students were. Excuse me, there's a siren in the background. It was easy to keep tabs on the students and give them comments through that. And because a lot of the students at the school that I work at are accustomed to using Docs and Drive, that was a fairly easy thing to start. Same with Padlet. Padlet's very straightforward. If students aren't used to using it, there's no steep learning curve necessarily. I would definitely be wary of overwhelming students with online tools. But for me, I thought Docs and Padlet were both excellent tools.
Great. Another question in regard to writing. How did you motivate the students to write? And when working remotely, what was your assurance of them writing independently without exterior forces such as Google Translate?
That's a great question. I think we have at Schroth in the language department, we have our contract of understanding. We usually discuss these things. You know what aids they can use and what they can't use. They know, for example, for everything that relates to Google Translate stuff, they can't use it, but they can use word reference. So our students, they kind of know that. But of course, students will be tempted to go and look up things. But usually, I did some of the writing pieces were in the asynchronous work. And there, if they have used some of that, they also learned how to mention what tools that they have used, and then we discussed it. We talk about how to use it and how not to use it next time, if that's the right way or not the right way. And then in class, I gave them, like, they had to write on the spot, so they didn't have time to go and look up things. They just need to use the vocab that they had with them. And if they had a question, I was available to them. But I think we are all worried about like how students are using internet or anything else to translate, and we need to come to a place where we are in fact acknowledge that these tools are available to them and they are going to be available to them in the future at their work. Instead of saying you cannot use them, show them how best to use them so they are using them in a smart way, not just taking the first translation that they get or the first word that they get, but to go and then check it with the grammar rule that they have ruled, with the vocab that they have, with the structures that they have learned, to start correcting the translations and help them work on correcting these translations at some point.
I would agree with everything that George just said. I think laying the groundwork for your expectations for the class and giving them the tools for writing in the language that's accessible to them is important. One of the main pieces of negative feedback that I received from students about this project was just similar to any project that you have, similar to any group project that you have, where some students were doing more work than others. Some students were unable to be, were out of communication sometimes. You know, through Google Docs, you can see the history of who's working on what document and when, so that can be fairly helpful for keeping tabs on students' work, but also just being flexible with students and being forgiving if they have something going on at home that is causing extra stress. So the stakes weren't necessarily high. It definitely helped that we had a pass-fail system, and so students, I think, engaged. There was a little bit more of intrinsic motivation. Students engaged because they wanted to solve the problem that they were working on. That's not to say that there were moments when they didn't, but I think there was a good amount of motivation there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Georges and Ian, for sharing your time with us and your expertise. It's been very enlightening for us to hear about your process, how you handle big PBL topics at your school. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Chahwan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George and Ian, for that very informative presentation, and thank you, Nathan and Shalian, for moderating. I see there were lots of questions that came in. Are you both okay with people contacting you by email?
Sure.
If they have specific questions, okay, then that is good to know, and your contact information is right on the screen there. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it has been recorded, and the recording will be made available on our website tomorrow. New York State teachers who need proof of attendance for CTLE credit, please use the links provided at nectful.org/webinars. Teachers in other states may use the same links, but please consult your local school district and/or state regulations regarding documenting PD hours. On behalf of the NECTFL Board of Directors, thank you for attending this evening's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you again. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye, John.